Okay, folks, we have more than 75 people in the call, which is great. So we'll make a start. Just before I introduce the speaker, just a reminder to everyone to keep your microphones muted for now, just so we're not getting any feedback, and also that we're recording this meeting. So if you don't want to appear in the recording, then just simply turn your camera off, and there's no danger of you appearing where you don't want to be. Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, my name is Peter Gray. I'm the director of the Institute of Irish Studies at Queen's University Belfast, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to our regular Irish Studies Research Seminar this afternoon. It's my great pleasure to introduce our visiting speaker, visiting in the ether online, unfortunately not physically in Belfast. But someone who knows Belfast well, Professor Feargal Cochrane is now Emeritus Professor of International Conflict Analysis at the University of Kent at Canterbury. Feargal was previously the director of the Richardson Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies at Lancaster University, and a senior lecturer in the Department of Politics, Philosophy and Religion at Lancaster, and before that held posts at the Centre for the Study of Conflict at Ulster University, and with ourselves at the Institute of Irish Studies at Queen's. He's published widely in the areas of political violence and conflict transformation, both in the leading journals and also a number of important monographs, including Unionist Politics and the Politics of Unionism since the Anglo-Irish Agreement with Cork University Press in 2001, Ending Wars with Polity in 2008, The End of Irish America, Globalisation and the Irish Diaspora with Irish Academic Press in 2010, Northern Ireland, The Reluctant Peace with Yale in 2013, and last year in 2020, Breaking Peace, Brexit and Northern Ireland with Manchester University Press, and his most recent book, which has the title Northern Ireland, The Fragile Peace, has just been published this month by Yale. And it's on these interrelated subjects of the fragile peace in Northern Ireland and the politics of Brexit that Feargal is going to speak to us this afternoon. As you can see from his slides, his title is Brexit and Northern Ireland into an Uncertain Future. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Feargal, who's going to speak for about 40-45 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers after that. So Feargal, over to you.
Thanks very much, Peter, and thanks very much everybody else for taking part in this event. I'm delighted to be speaking under the banner of the Institute of Irish Studies again, and also obviously a soft spot for the Institute and for Queen's. And again, I'm sorry I'm not there in body, but I'm certainly there in spirit. So what I want to maybe just do is, you can see a very unseasonal metaphor there, but it was a suitably menacing looking Brexit, I think, which I think sort of encapsulates for me some of the issues that I'm going to be talking about. And you can certainly see it even in today's news and the news of the last couple of weeks. So I'll be touching on both books, really. The first book charts the negotiations from 2016 up to the end of 2019, and I suppose the impact on political institutions in Northern Ireland, political relationships, and also between Ireland and Britain. And the second book really tries to put Brexit in a more historical perspective, seeing it as, you know, one of the sort of iconic moments in Northern Ireland's political history. So I'll be trying to sort of touch both bases and also then look at the implications of Brexit for our short and medium term future. Try not to do too much crystal ball gazing, but there are certain issues that I think are already flagged up in the current political debate, and hopefully we can flesh them out in the discussion. The first book, really, the genesis of that was an event that we ran, myself and colleagues at the University of Kent, ran in Belfast with our friends in Belfast Stratagem and Quentin Oliver. And really it was about devolution and the future of devolution in Northern Ireland. And I remember the afternoon session. This took place on the 24th of June 2016, just to give you an idea of the context of it. And we flew over on the 23rd. Obviously, 23rd was Brexit Day. And we were a bit worried about the afternoon session, which we had a thing about, Brexit and the future of devolution. And I remember saying, what if it's going to be a bit of a, it's odds on remain. So what's it going to be to talk about? And needless to say, the Prime Minister had resigned by breakfast time the next day. And we lost several delegates who were having emergency meetings. And obviously the whole event was taken over by that decision. And that's when I really realized that, something seismic had happened and it was going to affect and has affected all of us since, whether unionist, nationalist, or other. None of us can really ignore it. And that's probably true for the next decade at least. I'm hoping that my subtitles don't get more pessimistic, but you can see a certain trend. Initially, I'd started off with a question mark at the end of Breaking Peace, and halfway through writing it, I just dispensed with the punctuation. And actually, one of the ironies really of that was that I had thought Breaking Peace was just going to be about Ireland, but you can see that actually Great Britain is also being traumatized by Brexit and still is being. So that's the sort of the story of the two books. I'll be talking about both of them during the presentation. And in the Breaking Peace book, I use this meteor metaphor. It's not very easy to say, but Brexit really hit us like a meteor from outer space, and nobody really saw it coming or saw its implications coming. And if you trace it back, it's interesting how little debate there really was about Brexit until relatively shortly before the June vote. That was partly because we had an awful lot to argue about regardless of Brexit in Northern Ireland, and we're arguing about an awful lot regardless of Brexit. But again, everybody, and I think including the DUP, thought it was an odds-on Remain vote, which probably meant that our critical faculties maybe weren't as well honed as they maybe could have been. But it certainly hit us, and I think it hit Boris Johnson like a bolt from the blue as well to some degree. Even Nigel Farage was predicting a Remain outcome on the 23rd of June. So to some degree, it was an unexpected outcome, and its ripple effects then sort of spread out from 2016 onwards. And I think that, and this is a point I make in both of the books, which is that 2016, I think, goes down as one of those dates in our calendar, right back to 1921. And of course, we're now in the centenary year. And 2021 is up there on the sort of chronology. Back to 1921, but 2016 certainly holds its own in terms of those, 1921 when partition took place, Northern Ireland was created. 1968, 69 when political violence really erupted. 1972 when Stormont was prorogued. 1985 the Anglo-Irish Agreement was signed. This sounds like the greatest hits of Northern Ireland, or maybe worst hits depending on your viewpoint. And 1994, the ceasefires, 1998, the Good Friday Agreement, Belfast Agreement, and 2021. So 2016 for me is up there, probably up there with 1921 in terms of its importance. Certainly up there with 1972 for me anyway. So 3 takeaway points from this presentation, I think. And the first one I wanted to make is that Brexit presents a challenge for devolution. To some, again, ironically, a little bit like 1972. And I think the Unionist politicians in 1972 had lulled themselves into a sense that actually Northern Ireland's special, Northern Ireland's different, devolution's here to stay. But Ted Heath was able to whip it away as quickly as he could issue it, even though the Unionists walked out, technically speaking. But London demonstrated that they call the shots constitutionally, and power ultimately resides in Westminster and in London, not in Belfast. And Brexit, I think, also made that point clear, because, of course, Northern Ireland voted to remain in the EU. But that self-determination was denied, because, of course, it's not a devolved power. And Unionists would be quite right, the DUP would be quite right to say, actually, that's not a devolved matter. And it really is the United Kingdom's decision. So we were in a bit of a fool's paradise to some level, that we had local control. And Brexit really ran a bus through that. and demonstrated that actually it was London that had control. And it forced a binary choice on an ambiguous and sort of a bit of a ambiguous situation. So that's the first point. I think it presents a challenge for devolution, and devolution's got plenty of challenges as it is. The idea of local consent was trampled on, really, and that was inimical and ingrained within the peace process. Second point is that I think Brexit has increased our insecurities. It's brought identity politics back into the mix, and a lot of things that were sort of put to sleep maybe slightly, or we were given a bit of sort of, we were anesthetized to some of our identity issues, not all of them, but some of them. Those have been re-energized, I think, by the whole Brexit process. And the third point I wanted to talk about was really Anglo-Irish relations. And that, to me, has been the cement in the peace process and crucial for it. And if you can see that London and Dublin have moved from partners into more of a competitive relationship. And I think Northern Ireland, regardless of your political complexion, I think that is not going to help relationships within Northern Ireland if London and Dublin are not on the same page. And they certainly haven't been in recent years. Just to move it forward then to talk about Brexit, one of the interesting things about Brexit was, even though we talk about our country and the United Kingdom, it was actually England that took the decision. It certainly wasn't Scotland, and it certainly wasn't Northern Ireland. So there is a certain amount of constitutional myopia, I think, over Brexit. And it wasn't a United Kingdom decision, because two of the nations, if I could use that word, in the United Kingdom voted for the opposite outcome. But we were suddenly pushed back into the notion of a unitary state, the United Kingdom being a unitary state. And again, the language, I think I'll come on to the language in a second, but the language is very important in the framing of it, because we were told that the people of Britain had spoken, the British people had spoken, but actually England had spoken primarily. And it hasn't really been the UK that's driven this project forwards. And that, I think, is obviously from the government's point of view, they needed to get a negotiating position from the 24th of June onwards, 2016. And they've tended to airbrush out the fact that there's been a lot of, and there has continued to be a lot of disagreement over where we're going with it. Again, the point I'm trying to make here is that the Good Friday Agreement allowed us space between these identities, between the Britishness and the Irishness. It allowed us to have both of those flags if we'd wanted them, or to choose one or other. And of course, this issue of consent and voting, we also, of course, we had the opportunity to vote for the Good Friday Agreement in a referendum. But referendums are very bad at ambiguity, and peace negotiations are really, they live or die on their ability to turn zero-sum equations into positive-sum equations, which might sound like a bit of sort of rhetoric or sort of soundbitery, but the ambiguity within the Good Friday Agreement meant that we could agree to differ. We weren't confronted with a binary about where the border was, about what our identity was, and which of our countries we lived in, which of these countries, if either, that we lived in. So it lived or died on the maybe question. Well, I may stay with the status quo. Northern Ireland may remain within the United Kingdom, or it may do something else. And the destination then became less important than the agreeing to, well, let's see how it goes. But the problem with referendums is that they're very bad at ambiguity, and they're very good at choices. It's very easy to make a choice in a referendum between one thing and another thing. And of course, with the Belfast Agreement, the Good Friday Agreement, and you can see there in the image, it's your decision was written into the whole document. The whole idea of it was that the agreement wasn't done to us, it was done by us, it was done with us, and we were architects of it. And of course, we had a referendum which underpinned it. And as Tony Blair memorably said, that on the day, on the 10th of April, 1998, He said it's either mutually assured benefit or mutually assured destruction, our decision, people in Northern Ireland. And so this idea of the fact that it's the consent of the people of Northern Ireland to political change became part of the sort of, I suppose, the wallpaper ever since. And we're now a generation in. And it's probably also worth remembering that the Irish government also changed its constitution on the back of the consent principle and changed its articles 2 and 3 to be purely aspirational. And that, of course, was very important for the Unionist community as part of the trust building aspect of their buy-in to the whole process. So the whole notion of our consent to these arrangements, and of course we've got a power sharing system within the whole apparatus of devolution as well, and which again has sort of promoted this idea that it's all about the people of Northern Ireland choosing. But of course Brexit sort of problematized that idea of choice and self-determination. Now I want to come on to a little bit more specifically the language that was used after the 23rd of June and after Theresa May became Prime Minister. And really the landmark speech for this was the Lancaster House speech in January 2017, when Theresa May said, Brexit is Brexit, and she laid out the fact that this was going to be, a relatively hard Brexit in principle. We're leaving the customs union, leaving the single market. Britain's borders would once again be its own, and British laws would once again be sovereign, and so on and so forth. Now, the language of this was, I think, very important and very easy to miss. A little over 6 months ago, the British people voted for change, which is, of course, true. They voted to shape a brighter future for our country. That's probably in the maybe pile. They voted to leave the European Union and embrace the world. And I would put that in the possible pile, possible not pile. And of course, what's happening here is that referendums are very bad at nuance, and they're very bad at putting flesh on the bones of a simple choice. And again, this became part of the argument. What really did people vote for? They voted to leave the EU, or at least some of them did, and some of them voted not to. And a lot of things were then sort of laid over this decision about really what people wanted out of this decision. Second point, so that's the framing of the language. The other point, of course, was that the British people did vote for change, but 16 million of them voted for no change. And 2 of the nations within the United Kingdom voted for no change as well. So there's a bit of reductionism going on in this Brexit project, that a lot of people who, the Remainiacs, were putting their hands up and saying, well, not me, actually. And so this inevitably created a tension. And of course, the other point is that in Northern Ireland, the fact that 56% voted to remain, I think, belies the fact that a lot more nationalists voted to remain than unionists. So 80 to 90% of nationalists voted to remain, and about 38 to 40% of unionists voted to remain. So in other words, Brexit didn't complicate the ethno-national division in Northern Ireland, actually underpinned it. And ever since then, what became grafted onto it was a sort of orange or green issue. Remain and leave sort of morphed into a unionist versus nationalist issue, particularly when the Ulster Unionist Party, who had been on balance Remain, decided after the 24th of June 2016 to throw their lot in with the leave option of the United Kingdom. So moving to aspirations then, this is again Theresa May's speech in 2017. We will work to deliver a practical solution that allows the maintenance of the common travel area with the Republic while protecting the integrity of the United Kingdom's immigration system. Sounds quite magnanimous on initial reading. Nobody wants to return to the borders of the past, so we will make it a priority to deliver a practical solution as soon as we can. Again, nothing too scary in that language on first reading, but everybody in Ireland took about a nanosecond to decode it, both north and south. So what does we will work to deliver something mean? Well, it means you could try your hardest, but it doesn't mean you're going to actually do anything or achieve anything. And secondly, you can see that everything is contingent on something else. So the common travel area is contingent on the UK's immigration system. And of course, nobody wants to return to the borders of the past, but that doesn't mean you're not going to get them. And as soon as we can, could be tomorrow, could be 100 years from now. So the worry was that the aspirations didn't really match up with the actions of the British government. And as time went on, this really began to grate, initially with the nationalist and the Irish government and the nationalist community, but more recently with the unionist community over the protocol, which I'll come on to in a second. So there was a mismatch really over a period of years between what the UK said they would like to do and guarantees about what would actually happen. And again, people in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland very aware of what the border did mean, 20, 30 years ago. And in Britain, really, it did not feature in Brexit at all. It really wasn't an issue, in the referendum campaign, and really wasn't an issue initially in the negotiations. So this brings us on to Boris Johnson, and to some degree, Boris Johnson's approach has been similar to Theresa May's in this idea of sort of cakeism, of talking about using slightly woolly language to talk about where he's going with the Northern Ireland Protocol and what's going to happen subsequently. You can see there, hopefully, Boris Johnson speaking at the DUP annual party conference in 2018. It was a very popular act that year. He's probably not going to be back for the foreseeable, I would suggest. But Boris Johnson had sort of three main approaches to this. The first was to say what people wanted to hear, and that's certainly what he did in 2018. We got to bin the backstop. This was before he was elected Conservative Party leader and Prime Minister. So got to bin the backstop. It would be unconscionable to sign up to a Brexit deal that damaged Northern Ireland or damaged the integrity of the United Kingdom. And the backstop was anathema to Boris Johnson. And you can see him there in the Ballymena bus factory just a little while before he metaphorically drove that bus over Arlene Foster. And a lot of unionists, as far as they would be concerned, and I think unionists would probably agree, that Boris Johnson has been less than consistent over his approach to them and over his approach to Brexit. So first of all, he said things that people want to hear. The second tactic has been to say things that are just inaccurate. So there'll be no non-tariff barriers between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. That a border, we can use technical solutions. It's just like extracting, traffic tariffs from cars between boroughs of London and so on. And he hasn't really worried too much about being accurate. And a third approach to this has really been about using his, what you might kindly call his particular personal rhetorical style to muddy the waters, really, about what he means. So he has created this sort of amiable sort of buffoon act, but it's very studied and it's very careful. At least I think so, because it allows him to reverse policy. It allows him to be unclear and ambiguous about what he means, and that's really put down just to his, well, it's Boris's style, it's just, you can take him the wrong way. So that's quite clever politics, actually, for him in the Conservative Party. But it certainly left the Unionists feeling very bruised at what they didn't get the Brexit that they thought they were going to get. And again, that's been, I think, problematic for them. And I'll go on a little bit of time to talk about the implications of that in a second. But I wanted to just move on to Anglo-Irish relations and talk a little bit about those, because again, this has really been the cement in the peace process. And since 1998, we've had several state visits to Ireland and to United Kingdom from the Queen and from the Irish President. And there you can see a picture of Martin McGuinness. I think that was the Queen's Jubilee. I think it was Lyric Theatre. Peter Robinson and Martin McGuinness. That would have been you would have been committed if you'd suggested that would have happened in the 1970s. And Anglo-Irish relations really, I think, improved after both Ireland and the United Kingdom entered the EEC in 1973. And prior to that point, after it as well to some degree, but certainly a trend began where they started to see Northern Ireland as a joint problem. Prior to 1973, it was very much more of a domestic UK issue, and the Republic of Ireland were not considered to be, to have a right to give an opinion on what should happen there. And I think Anglo-Irish relations warmed up considerably since 1973, not just because of joining the EU, but just simply because civil servants got to know one another. There were a lot of opportunities to meet, but also interests were similar. As the EU expanded, as the EEC turned into the European Union, the economic and political interests of Ireland and the United Kingdom became similar. They were on the same side of the table. And I think that, arguments, of course, there were many arguments between the governments up to the Anglo-Irish Agreement and beyond. But increasingly, those arguments were kept in-house. Certainly in the 1990s, the arguments between the UK and Ireland were, as far as possible, kept indoors. Whereas today, the dirty linen is washed in public quite regularly. And recently we've had Simon Coveney, saying that, questioning the honesty and integrity of the United Kingdom, and saying that, its good faith as a negotiating partner in Brexit is called into question. Which again is that's quite a loud hailer in diplomatic terms. Again, that would have been not really the way things would have happened prior to 2016. Rows would, as far as possible, have been contained, and these less and less. It's becoming less and less clear that that's the case. Now, that of course could be a Brexit blip. Could just be the sort of the collateral damage of the Brexit vote and the getting to a deal, which was very traumatic. Eventually got there in the end, but it was quite a traumatic 4 years. It could be a Brexit blip, and it could be, it could be patched up. And of course, those meetings between heads of state were just symbolic, and they didn't really matter that much to people on the ground. There were other things that were mattering to them, but symbolism is important nonetheless. And it's going to take a while, I think, for Anglo-Irish relations to repair themselves. And the reason I brought this up was because when we all get past COVID and we can all return to the Institute of Irish Studies, hopefully, and we can walk out of Queen's, we can turn left, we can go up the Malone Road, and we can look at all the expensive houses. Now, if you do that, it's very unlikely you'll go there and you'll say, look at the foundations on that mansion. Aren't those beautiful? You're not probably going to do that. But if those foundations weren't there, the house would fall down. Same in Helens Bay. You go and look at the posh people's houses down there, and you're not probably going to say, wow, look at those foundations. Aren't they marvelous? But without the foundations, and apologies to people on the Malone Road in Helens Bay, but you get the point. Without the foundations, the house is going to fall down. And foundations like this take years to build. and of course took 15, 20 years to really build up. And they're vital, I think, for the health of the political health of Northern Ireland, because without them, it's going to be a much rockier experience, I think. And one of the reasons I think it's probably not a blip is because the interests of Ireland and the United Kingdom are now not the same. One of them is inside the European Union and one of them is not. And I think that that will, over time, only stretch into different economic interests. And well, hopefully that will not be the case. But the metaphor that I sort of use sometimes for this is having two big ocean liners and a rope across to a little tugboat. And Northern Ireland's the tugboat, and it's got a rope over to the United Kingdom ship, and it's got a rope over to the Irish ship. And these two ships are very imperceptibly now moving, or not moving in parallel. They're just ever so slightly deviating. And those ropes are getting tighter and tighter. And I think those will tighten and they'll ping off eventually. And that's the worry for people in Northern Ireland. It's not going to be a comfortable experience when those ropes start to stretch. And I think you can already see the seeds of that happening. So it may be a blip. We'll have to see where we go with that. Post-Brexit, the mood music is different. I think there's two reasons for that. I've sort of covered those already, really. The atmosphere is definitely chillier. I think the negotiations pitched Ireland and the United Kingdom on different sides of the table. And there's sort of Simon Coveney and Leo Varadkar sort of got it in the neck from a lot of unionists over the last year or two. Pulling on the green jersey, as it was called, and seemed to be sort of playing politics and weaponizing Brexit. Whereas Enda Kenny was seen as a sort of a nicer Irish Taoiseach. I'm not convinced that Enda Kenny would have been any different to Simon Coveney or Leo Varadkar. He was simply earlier, and he was there before the Brexit vote and initially after Brexit. Now, he did say in February 2017, and I'm quoting directly, "Let me also make one thing absolutely clear. Ireland will be on the EU side of the table when the negotiations begin," unquote. And that was inevitable. It was always going to be the case. But I think he was earlier in the piece before a lot of these, what you might call negotiating shenanigans, sort of come into play, and frustrations, and possible agreements, and I think Ireland used its soft power very cleverly with the European Union and built alliances in ways that I think the United Kingdom underestimated. Because Ireland, let's face it, is a pretty small country. But it certainly punched above its weight with the EU to the point where I think the EU looked at Ireland first whenever the UK said something about the withdrawal agreement. I think the UK used its soft power very badly and squandered it, and still squandering it, really. It's interesting that Boris Johnson changed his position on the internal market bill it seems several hours after Joe Biden won the presidency. And I don't think those two things are unconnected. But Boris Johnson, wants to have, it's cakeism. He wants to have his cake and he wants to eat it. And he said that. And the problem is that the EU wants him to, choose one or the other. So first of all, therefore the negotiations have been fraught for everybody, and that's inevitably going to be bruising, and has bruised everybody, I think, concerned. But I think structurally, the objectives now are different. I think with one of these countries inside the European Union and one of them outside, I think that this is definitely going to complicate the Anglo-Irish relationship from this point onwards. And I think you're already seeing you're already seeing that happening. I suppose the question now is, will there be violence after Brexit? And we're now seeing graffiti. The whiff of cordite is in the nostrils a little bit due to loyalist discontent. We're getting a little bit of a whiff of a return to the Anglo-Irish Agreement period in 1985, 1986, where Unionists are obviously looking for a coalition, as broad a coalition as they can get. And the DUP are trying to build that, and I think are successfully building that. There is a broad Unionist coalition building that is dipping its toe towards loyalist paramilitarism. Now, of course, the LCC are saying that they're going to be perfectly democratic, but there is certainly there is a sort of a slight. I mean, people like Samuel Wilson have used the phrase, they want a guerrilla war, which went down like a bucket of sick for a lot of people. But there is this issue of how far do you go with direct action and with a political agreement that you don't like. Now, initially, the violence issue, the worry was that a hard border on the island of Ireland would create, violence, and dissident Republicans would kick off. And more recently, the worry now is that that violence will come from loyalist sources. And to be fair to loyalists, they did call their ceasefire in 1994 on the basis that the union was secure. At least that was one of the bases that they called their ceasefire in 1994. And it looks to a lot of unionists like it's not secure, or it's not as secure as it was. And that's hopefully something we can talk about in the discussion. And of course, the point being that wherever you draw a line on a map, some people are going to be unhappy about that line. Arguably, Northern Ireland exists because of a line drawn on a map, and now we've got another one in its centenary year, which is quite ironic, which is maybe a semi-permeable border in the Irish Sea. But wherever you draw lines in divided societies, you're going to get people very unhappy about where those lines are and how they can avoid them or change them. What we've got now is a semi-permeable border within the United Kingdom. There's a trade border that treats Northern Ireland differently from the rest of the United Kingdom. It's very difficult to get away from that fact. But it's unionists that have brought that about through their opposition to Theresa May's version of Brexit. The protocol, therefore, is some would argue is the solution, not the problem. If you've got Brexit, and if you've got a hard Brexit, then you're going to have a border. I'm not going to rehearse those arguments again. You're all aware of them. The point being that the protocol was the least worst option for Boris Johnson. The protocol was the least worst option for the United Kingdom, just as partition was the least worst option for the United Kingdom and the British government in 1921, and for that matter, the Free State. So, so we'll have to see where this is clearly destabilizing people in Northern Ireland. I suppose my view of this is that returning to the Anglo-Irish Agreement is probably not the best plan, because as people like Sam McBride have already noted, that was an unmitigated disaster in 1985, 1986. Yes, they had a coalition, but it really got them nowhere. And so unionists really, I think, have to think, what is a constructive strategy that is going to strengthen the union? And one of the ironies of all of this was that the DUP was quite pragmatic in the first place in Brexit. Back in 2016, it allowed a free vote, which is quite unusual for the DUP, but it did want to allow a free vote. But then hardened up, and then it moved it into being a sort of article of faith. But actually, the more loyalist violence is threatened, the further away the union gets, I would argue. So just move on to Unionist Responses now, because obviously a picture of the LCC there. I'm not sure if that's a deliberate attempt to sort of remind people of the Solemn League and Covenant and Edward Carson. Maybe it was just me having a flashback. And there's Reverend Ian Paisley and Peter Robinson at an Ulster resistance meeting back at the Anglo-Irish Agreement days. Unionists are, one thing unionists have got going is that they are united against the protocol. They all want rid of it. Their problem is that they voted for Brexit. They were the ones who were pushing Brexit, and the DUP were the ones who had the leverage to get the type of Brexit they wanted and squandered it. I think one of probably the biggest strategic mistake unionism has made in 100 years. There's a debating point for us, but I can't think of a bigger one. There are certainly PhDs to be done on this issue, and hopefully some of the people logging in will be writing books or doing PhDs about this. How did the DUP get themselves into the position where they've become their own jailers, effectively erecting border posts, or they've stopped erecting them, but inevitably these will be erected in Larne and in Belfast to implement a trade border when they had to leverage in 2017, 2018 to avoid that. It is quite Freudian, I think. And Peter Robinson mentioned back in 1985 that Northern Ireland had been moved onto the window ledge of the Union after the Anglo-Irish Agreement. In other words, they were sort of semi-detached from the Union, and they felt very, upset, and more than upset, that the British government would do this to them. And you could see that with Ian Paisley Jr.'s remarks last month, about what have we done to you to deserve this type of thing in the House of Commons. Now, the irony with Brexit is that unionists have jumped up onto the window ledge of the Union rather than being forced there by Margaret Thatcher or Boris Johnson. So the response so far has been unified, but their problem is they're looking back to a failed strategy, and they need a new strategy that's actually going to get them what they want, which is a more secure place within the Union. And one way to do that, obviously, is to maybe make the protocol work for a way that uses Northern Ireland's very unique position. And we'll have to see where that goes. Don't want to talk for too much longer because I'm sure there's lots of discussion to be had. I just wanted to sort of say a little bit about Boris Johnson and the protocol and what's happened since. So Boris Johnson visited Belfast there, was it last week or the week before? Probably had a lovely chat with Arlene Foster. I'm sure a frank one, but I'm sure he told her what she wanted to hear. But in my view, Johnson is very likely to agree with unionists that the protocol is terrible. He's probably going to try and argue the toss with the EU over the implementation of the protocol. But I think it's very unlikely that he will ditch it completely, because that will leave him without a deal with the EU and without a deal with the United States. And I think if that was going to be the strategy, then the internal market bill may have lasted a bit longer. And there's zero chance of a deal with the United States if, it seems to me, if the United Kingdom reneges on the protocol and the withdrawal agreement. I suppose the other point of this is that this is still breaking peace. This is, to me, making Northern Ireland even more fragile, because I would be very surprised if the protocol was not the first item of business in the 2022 Assembly election. Let's hope that the Assembly gets to 2022. I think that's now not certain. It's then going to be another short hop to 2024 vote on whether to continue the protocol arrangements or whether or not to do that. And then every 4 years from then, we are going to keep picking at that scab. So that's the worry, that the protocol, yes, has destabilized politics in Northern Ireland and will continue to destabilize it, but it's probably a better option than a border on the island of Ireland. It's certainly going to dominate politics. And that's also, I think, going to bring forward the demands for a border poll. And again, this is another issue that was an academic thought experiment up to 2016. Nobody was talking about a border poll really seriously. Now everybody's talking about it. People may not want one. I'll get on to that in a second, but it's now sort of part of the mainstream political debate. What that actually means is another matter, of course, but I think that the more intense the debate on the protocol, I think the more loud the claims for a border poll are probably going to get. Bertie Ahern has been calling for one, for instance, and I think I think that's now on the agenda. So we're now 100 years in. We've reached the ton. And I think that looking ahead, we're in our centenary year, and the question now is, what sort of Northern Ireland are we going to get over the next 100 years? How long is it going to last? Is it going to last another 100 years? I think on current form, probably not, be my view. I think that Northern Ireland's position in its current constitutional form has never been as imperiled as it was since 1921. No, that would be my opinion. I don't think that's been caused by Brexit, but I think Brexit has triggered all these other problems. Like it's been a catalyst for all these other issues that weren't resolved in 1998. They were parked and they weren't resolved. Scotland is more likely than not to have another referendum on independence in the next 10 years, I would suggest. I think obviously the British government's denying that at the moment, but another 10 years of Boris Johnson is probably going to soften up Scottish opinion quite nicely on that one. I think that's an even bet. I think a border poll in the next 10 years on Irish independence is probably also an even money bet. So questions that didn't have to be asked about identity and constitutional integrity have been asked, and the answers to those questions are unpredictable. The answers are unpredictable. The questions didn't have to be asked, but Brexit has asked them, and I think the answers are unpredictable. And again, one of the ironies here is that it's really not going to be Sinn Féin voters or DUP voters who decide this. The people who decide will be the undecideds. It'll be the 20% in the middle who could be swayed either way. So I think the next 10 years we'll see a sort of a race for support from those supporting the union and those looking for Irish reunification, and those two sides will sort of slug it out. But it's the undecideds who'll decide. So this slide might seem a little left field. That's comedian Ed Byrne there on the top right, and Alanis Morissette, a Canadian singer who had some of you of a certain age will remember the song Ironic. Isn't it ironic? And Ed Byrne did this skit about the fact that actually most of the stuff in her song wasn't ironic. Like, it's like rain on your wedding day. That's just unfortunate. And I think Alanis Morissette would be much better off looking at Northern Ireland politics than the song itself. It mightn't make as good a song, but I think that Brexit was all about taking back control, but I think is actually the people that have pursued the union most avidly have been the ones that have undermined it in a way that Sinn Féin could never have managed to do. I think that Sinn Féin for the last 100 years has mostly sort of, let's say, not been particularly enamored with the idea of Northern Ireland, put it like that. Well, nobody's as big a defender of self-determination in Northern Ireland as Sinn Féin now. Sinn Féin was also on the Eurosceptic side of the Brexit debate until the latter stages. And again, now is using the EU as part of its offer for Irish unification. The protocol, I think, as well is ironic because, like partition 100 years ago, it's the least worst option for the British government. It's not an ideological goal; it's the least worst option. And I think the whole point is that the political process in Northern Ireland requires a certain amount of ambiguity. If I could be facetious for a second, it's a bit like the booze cruise. You get on the boat for a good time. You don't really worry too much about the destination. It's about enjoying yourself while you're on the boat. But then you're suddenly told a destination you don't want to go to. Then you want to get off the boat, and that's the issue. So there's a lot of ironies, I think, in maybe talk about that later. So we're now, commemorating or commiserating. And we're certainly, I don't think anybody could deny that partition has been important in Northern Ireland. The partition of Ireland has been important. And we're now, at the point of, I think, work out, where do we go? How do we deal with commemoration? And obviously, there's been issues there with. I think even today in the Assembly, complaining about refusing to put a statue up shows a sort of intolerance. And there's a lot of whataboutery and there's a lot of short-term vote grabbing going on rather than long-term fence mending. And the problem with the political system in Northern Ireland is that there's very little incentives for reaching across the aisle in voting terms. There's a lot more incentives to build up your own political capital within your own ethnic group. So one area where there has been some sense of joint approach certainly has been in COVID response. Although even in that, there was, we want to align with the UK, we want to align with Ireland, but nonetheless, at least Northern Ireland was seen as one community with one common interest, which stop people dying. If there's a little bit more of that in terms of joint enterprise, then I think Northern Ireland has got a future. But without that, I think it's, I think the Assembly's days as a working devolved seat of powers are numbered. Just go through these very quickly. Obviously, Northern Ireland's 100. We've got a lot larger sort of non-aligned section of the community now than we had in 1921. But that's not really an awful lot of use to unionists. The fact that there's 20% who could be moved one way or the other, because the case for the union is less clear 100 years later than it was, or at least it's arguably the point. It's less clear now than it was in 1921. I think that the role of the Catholic Church in the Irish Republic now is much less obvious. The Irish economy is much stronger than it was, and of course we're now looking at an Ireland that's within the European Union versus a United Kingdom that isn't. And a nationalist politician said this to me when I was writing one of the books, and said, it's actually forcing nationalists who didn't have a project of reunification to actually is pushing them towards that, because it's sucking the political air out of the ambiguity that they were existing in. I think the equation of the status quo within a European Union context, within a system of devolved regions, is a different type of equation to one where you are in a United Kingdom outside the EU, outside the protections of the EU, and dominated by a right-wing conservative government. That's a different type of equation, I think, for nationalists in Northern Ireland. Other point is, for nationalists who are asking for a border poll, I think that's the easy bit. I think the substance of this vision on reunification actually needs to attract a lot of non-nationalists and the Irish Republic. And it's trotted out, I think, regularly, but what it means in substance hasn't really been fleshed out. It's only laterally starting to be talked about. So there's an awful lot of, I think, arguments and discussions to be had there. Last week, we had Micheál Martin cautioning against setting a date for a border poll until there's evidence of reconciliation in the north via the Shared Island Initiative. But of course, that's not what the Good Friday Agreement says about a border poll. So is Micheál Martin guilty of sort of cakeism too, to use the Boris Johnson metaphor, where he signs up to all of the Good Friday Agreement, but not that bit about the border poll subsequently? So there's clearly, I think, divisions in politics in the Republic over this. Bertie Ahern has called for one. And I think that this is a quote from Micheál Martin on the St. Patrick's Day interview last week. "It's divisive. It puts people back into trenches too early. My view is that I want to develop a shared dialogue, irrespective of one's constitutional preferences." So there's certainly no desire on part of the Irish government to have this quickly, and there's clearly, I think, discussions need to happen in the Irish Republic as well over that. So I just want to finish off by, when I was asked to speak at the Institute, it reminded me that I was a junior fellow back in 1994, and it reminded me of one of my earliest publications. You can see some other Queen's University alumni there on the same issue. And I had an article called "Any Takers? The Isolation of Northern Ireland." And that was 27 years ago. Hard to believe. And some of the points in that article probably germane to 2021, which makes me realize what's the last 27 years been about. But I'll just finish there and thank you. And if you want to find out more about the Breaking Peace book, there's a link on the slides there to it in Manchester University Press. And if you want to find out more about the Fragile Peace book, the Northern Ireland Yale book, you can find it on that link. I think No Alibis is selling it at £1 off. It's only £10.99 in No Alibis. I'm sure other local bookshops are also selling it. Hopefully at not too big a discount. But I think, Peter, I'll stop talking now and we can open things up for discussion.
Thanks very much, Feargal. It's a really stimulating paper. I think I'm contractually obliged to say other local bookshops are available. No, not that many of them anymore. So we'll just give you a minute to turn off the screen sharing, and hopefully we can get you back on camera, and then we'll move into Q&A.
Okay.
Perfect.
Is that turned off?
Yeah. That is, yeah, that's great.
Right.
And hopefully we can get you back on camera. And just while Feargal's doing that, just a reminder to people, if you want to ask a question, right? So that's great, Feargal, got you again. There should be a little button or icon on your screen that has a little hand on it, or a hand and a smiley face. If you click on that and the technology works, and I should see that you want to ask a question, and I'll invite you to put your question directly to Feargal. Just unmute yourself when you're ready to go. So let's make a start. So we've got Francis first. Over to you, Francis.
Hello, Feargal. That was a great lecture. Really enjoyed that. A quick question, sort of as a sort of chess question. Is it your perception, because you currently are in the United Kingdom and you're in the mainland, that Brexit has changed the opinion of the general English public in relation to the Union in Northern Ireland, therefore making it easier for a hard and secure Boris Tory government to put further distance between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom?
Thanks, Francis. Good question, that. I think my view would be not an awful lot, actually. I think that there's been, I think there has been, a desire amongst some unionists to say that the perfidious Albion and the behaviour of some of the politicians at Westminster has been just a minority of the sort of metropolitan elite who are doing this for realpolitik. I think that there's been a consistent approach or view, and I think polling evidence bears this out. Well, I'll say two things about polling evidence, but generally speaking, most people in Great Britain want Northern Ireland to take its own decisions over its future. I think there are some who want to hang on to Northern Ireland, come what may, but that's very much a minority and has been a minority for a long time. I think that with Brexit, I think that that was overlaid with another project then, and it's not just Brexiteers who were fair weather friends of the Union. I think it was also Remainers who were also, Brexit became the big issue and the Union could look after itself after that. So I think that I don't really think it's made a massive difference to opinion in Britain. I think that, I think Team GB is called Team GB for a reason, right? Northern Ireland is sort of airbrushed out of the Olympics, and it's under Team GB, and I think that's quite a dangerous thing. I think the team needs to be Team GB and NI for unionists, and I don't really think that Brexit has really changed that underpinning point that yes, they would like Northern Ireland to stay in the Union, but if Northern Ireland wants to do something else, the vast majority of people in Great Britain would be happy to go along with it. I think, and I'm not sure Brexit has really changed that much, to be honest.
Okay. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Francis. I've got Adrian Galka next. Adrian.
Hi. Thanks, Feargal. I enjoyed that very much. I've just been reading recently what Theresa Villiers said at the time of the referendum, and her stuff was all about immigration control. It was about kind of reconciling Brexit with immigration control. She seemed to assume that immigration control was going to be the big issue in terms of the border. The border, would it be necessary to have infrastructure on the border for the purposes of immigration control? And she said no. And that issue has just completely disappeared as an issue as to why there's might be any requirement for any sort of any steps towards a hard border to be taken. Has that issue disappeared because of the virus, or is it just completely disappeared in the context of what has been negotiated?
Good to see you, Adrian, and a good question. To put a positive spin on this, I mean, it's interesting how issues become non-issues when a certain amount of time passes. Power sharing used to be an issue. That's no longer an issue. You know, the north-south bodies was an external solution. It used to be an issue. It's passage of time, it stops being an issue. Immigration was the big issue of Brexit. You know, and actually it wasn't. I mean, one of the ironies is it really wasn't about being in the EU at all. It was about immigration. You know, that's what Brexit was, and it was about the Conservative Party's future. Those were really what Brexit was about. If it was about Europe, we would have had a debate about Europe, and we didn't really have that. And isn't it interesting? I think that the debate on immigration has disappeared. And now the debate about the Irish border, I think very few politicians in Great Britain during the Brexit debate, and probably since, really understand what the border is, where it is, how long it is, the cross-fertilization, the movement of people between the Irish border. They don't really understand that, I don't think. It was just a bullet point on a briefing paper, and I'm putting that slightly unfairly, but I don't really think they smelt it in a way that people in Ireland smelt it. And if you look at British politics in Great Britain now, immigration has just disappeared once Brexit happened. Partly maybe because the Conservative Party are in power, and when Labour were in power, I think issues of targets, how many were coming into the country, was a much bigger issue. Partly, I think, because the media, the tabloid media, knew it could make trouble for Labour with large amounts of people coming in. But once the Conservative Party became, the hegemonic and got into power, it became uncomfortable for them to hear those numbers. And maybe Farage's sort of, fox was shot to some degree over that when Brexit got done, that they don't want to keep talking about immigration. So, yeah, disappeared. But I think that's a good thing. I think that there's a lesson there that things that are massive political issues today, when you stop sort of confronting people with that issue, it's much easier for that issue to be laid down. And I think when you confront people with the issue, say, give ground in this particular issue, then it's very difficult for them to do it or talk about anything else.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Adrian. Kevin Rogers is next.
Hello. I think Brexit's is divided the country because some parts that were in England, like London and Cambridge and Oxford, all Remain areas, and a strong Remain vote in South Cambridgeshire. All those areas, and there's a lot of students are a lot of Remainers as well. Basically, with Brexit, they've stopped the freedom to go and travel in Europe. That's stopped it. And also, I think COVID-19. I think Wales. I was shocked at the poll recently. Well, 39% of Welsh people want independence from the UK now. It's gone up because of COVID, because Boris made this and that. And also, Scottish independence. Now, Sturgeon's now she's being cleared. I think she'll stay on as leader of the SNP, and I think that she'll win the election in the Scottish Parliament. And I think Scotland will be independence in 5-10 years, definitely. And I think United Ireland could happen 10 or 15 years. Depends on if the border poll goes the highest rate. And the census figures in Northern Ireland, there's more Catholics that have more children than Protestants. I noticed. That's what I noticed. I heard.
Just thanks, Kevin. Just to come back on that, you used a couple of very interesting phrases there, I thought, and I don't disagree with a lot of your analysis there, actually. But Brexit divided the country. certainly did, but it also forced us to talk about which country we actually lived in. And I think in the Northern Ireland context, the DUP sort of said, the country has taken a decision, the country has decided. But there's a lot of people living in Northern Ireland who have a different country, which is Ireland. So these flags that I put up in the slides, it forced us to pick a side when the whole point of the peace process was not having to pick a side or pick both sides. Now you might say that is paradoxical. How can you have, how can you back both horses in a race? But it doesn't matter if it's a paradox. It works for the moment. It provides a sort of space for us to move into, to the point where this other phrase you used about a united Ireland, I mean, a border poll might go in that direction. But I think, the devil is very much in the detail about what that means. And we've even got in the media today in Northern Ireland, arguments about, unionists getting guaranteed seats in cabinet and so on. And I think, there's a sort of assumption about what a united Ireland means that I think there's a lots of different varieties of what that might end up being. And that's one to bowl, I suppose, to unionists, which is under what, what's the case for the union? Peter Robinson sort of made this point. Unionists need to, get organised, make a case, make a coherent case for staying in the union. Otherwise, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland are going to be looking and thinking, well, maybe self-government's a good thing. Maybe we should have more of it, and maybe it's better than a rule from London. So the people who want the union have got to sort of think about what is it for and what are the benefits of it, and make that argument. And I think on the other side, nationalists can't just assume that they will, that they'll be in the majority and that magically some switch will be flicked and, there'll be a border poll and there'll be a united Ireland. I think that there's an awful lot of drilling into what that means substantively for nationalists on both sides of the border as well. But anyway, but interesting points. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Kevin. Nikki Williamson is next.
Hi, Feargal. I kind of did the opposite to you in that I grew up in Kent and I now live in Northern Ireland. So it was quite interesting having the census yesterday for me, because there's a question on it here. I don't know if it's across the whole of the UK, but there's a question on it here. What nationality do you consider yourself to be? And I did find that a really hard question to answer, because like you say, with, the Olympics as an example, I don't consider myself British. I consider myself UK-ish. That's not a thing, So the bit that I wanted to ask you about was, you said the more loyalist violence is threatened, the further away the union gets. I just wonder if I live in a very loyalist part of the island, but work in a very nationalist part, and I've got friends from very extreme ends of both those groups, and just would wonder, what that violence might lead to in terms of pushing away the union, maybe.
Yeah, well, thanks, Nikki. It just strikes me as, as it's not the right, and to be fair to the LCC, they were saying they were going to be peaceful and so on, and they weren't threatening this, but there is that spectre behind, behind the coalition of, going back to the sort of Ulster resistance idea and mobilization of loyalist paramilitaries. It was much easier for loyalists, I think, when the IRA was active, because it could argue that it was a counter-revolutionary movement and that security wasn't really being provided, it was defensive and security wasn't being provided for them by the state. So therefore they were going to operate. But without without that facility, it just looks, or it's very easily branded then as sort of criminal terrorism within the state. So it's going to be very hard for loyalists to operationalize violence, I think, on the back of the protocol, to give you an example, that doesn't look like it is anti-British, or that it is without a counterpunch in terms of Republican violence. So it's just going to turn people in Great Britain off in droves. It's also, I think, politically going to drive that 20%, or an awful lot of them, towards a border poll. the people who could be won by unionism in the middle, and there are quite a lot of them, and they will be crucial, I think, in the next generation, it's going to drive them away. And so, you know, the strategy for, you know, if I was a unionist strategist, I would be saying we've got to build up soft power in the Irish Republic, in America, in Britain. You know, we've got to win that argument. And, you know, looking back to the 1970s and 1980s isn't going to do that for them. And, you know, as you know yourself, I'm sure, Nikki, you know, coming from over here, a lot of that type of, you know, so, you know, unionist persona it's not really understood over in Great Britain, you know, by them. So unionists have got to speak in a language, I think, that that people in Britain understand and actually buy into. And going down that sort of loyalist paramilitary route is definitely not the way to go to do that, I think, anyway. Thanks. And you're lucky you live in Belfast, so that's a bonus.
We do love it.
It's great. Thank you, Nikki. Okay, do we have other questions? Maybe I might ask one while we're waiting for other hands to go up. So, Feargal, I mean, what we saw in the 2000s was a kind of generational shift within unionism, you know, from the Ulster Unionist Party being the hegemonic party to the DUP being the Unionist hegemonic party. And that obviously had to do with kind of reactions against disillusionment with the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process. But I mean, is there the potential now for that shift to be reversed within unionism, given, I mean, what you have described as the kind of strong connections between the DUP and the failure? I mean, the kind of once in a century, or you know, mistake that the DUP have made over Brexit strategy. Is there any potential for that for those politics to be reversed?
Well, thanks, Peter. I mean, that's a great question, and for unionists, that's a $64,000 question, really. For the UUP, you know, there's a big issue for them there. So initially, they blamed the DUP for the protocol, and you know, quite rightly, a lot of unionists would probably say. But since then, they've felt that they've had to sort of go in, they've had to attack the protocol and go into this sort of semi-coalition with the DUP over that. The UUP should be winning votes from the DUP hand over fist as a result of what's happened since 2019, certainly. First of all, remain unionists, for start off. You know, they should be, you know, easy fruit for the UUP to pick, but they're going to the Alliance Party, a lot of them. The UUP isn't getting enough of them. Secondly, it should be a bit like, as you say, that, you know, the DUP was able to pick off the Ulster Unionist Party's responsibility for the Good Friday Agreement and people who were unhappy with that, and also the internal dysfunctionality of the UUP in the 2000s. You know, where poor old David Trimble ended up in the, you know, the Waterfront Hall, seemed every weekend, having, you know, emergency meetings and sort of getting one more chance to, you know, to keep the thing alive. And he kept losing votes every election. And the DUP, arguably, yes, the potential's there for them to be in a similar situation of unpopularity. But there's very little evidence so far to me that the UUP are making inroads to the DUP. 2022 elections, pretty critical there, if not other opinion polls before then. But, you know, you should be seeing the UUP really making strides, and we're not seeing that. And so there's another irony for us. You know, the DUP, you know, are getting it in the neck from a lot of people for the protocol, but actually the UUP have got just as many problems, because if they cannot make a dent in the DUP now, when will they ever do that?
Thanks, Feargal. I've got a question from Bridie McElhill.
Feargal.
Yeah.
I suppose this is all after the fact, but I was always curious as to why, with the Brexit referendum, they chose first past the 50%. for such an important decision for the United Kingdom, and why David Cameron didn't choose a higher percentage in order that he could be confident that this is what the country wanted.
Thanks, Bridie. Great question again. You know, it's great for political scientists because we've always got retrospect to look at, and it's much harder for politicians because they're in the here and now and they don't have the benefit of hindsight, and what we do. Why did they not set a proportional majority, or and you know, we tend to forget this now, but the Union nearly disintegrated in 2014 with the first Scottish independence referendum, and the Tories, well, everybody in GB political classes, you know, got the wind up them just in the last week and haired up there, and you know, mobilised what they could to try and turn the vote around, which they did. You would think on the back of David Cameron's, and I think George Osborne, didn't he mention recently that his worst day in politics was that night, waiting for the result of the Scottish referendum, going down as the government that destroyed the Union. You would think with that fresh in his memory that David Cameron would have thought, well, actually, let's build in some insurance policies here. And you're absolutely right. One way of doing that is to say, this is such a cataclysmic vote, let's build in a safety measure. I think the reason he didn't wasn't because he was stupid. I think it was because he was too weak. I think that he'd been pushed by UKIP into a position where he had to give an in-out referendum devoid of caveats. I don't really think he wanted to have a referendum that much, but effectively UKIP was driving the Conservative Party by, that period, 2012, 2015, 2016, and certainly. It was UKIP that was setting the agenda. The Tories were getting eaten, their vote was getting eaten into by UKIP. And, you could be sort of maybe cynical and say, the Tories became UKIP. Certainly for Brexit, they did. And they wanted to give as clean a choice as they could so that UKIP couldn't turn around and say, this is not Brexit as we have been promised. You've been sold a pup. This is not legitimate. So I think that's why he went for a 50% plus one, and maybe on the back of Scotland thought that mobilise Project Fear, mobilise, the banks, the businesses, get a campaign going, and that will win us the argument. But it was a massive miscalculation.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Bridie. Do we have any more questions? Any other hands, or shout out if you need to, if I'm not seeing your hand?
Adrian's on there. I think Adrian's on there.
Yeah, go ahead. Maybe that's an old hand from Adrian. Do you have any other questions anybody wants to ask? Kevin, do you want to ask another one?
Yeah, I saw the opinion polls for 2022. The DUP could come second place because they're losing support to the Alliance Party and the traditional Unionist Party, that Jim Allister's party, and that because they're taking a hard land stance on the Good Friday Agreement, and that also Sinn Féin is losing support to some SCLP as well. So that Sinn Féin will be the largest party in the future election, they reckon, in the opinion poll. And also Sinn Féin are doing well in Irish Republic. Fianna Fáil support's gone down in Irish Republic. It's going to Sinn Féin, and Sinn Féin are sometimes in the lead, sometimes Fine Gael's in the lead. But it's between the next election, the Irish election, it'll be interesting between Fine Gael and Sinn Féin, because Fianna Fáil support, Michael Martin's support's gone down a lot actually. He's 14 points, and the Fianna Fáil support's going to Sinn Féin. But if Sinn Féin win the next election, they need to get 45 or 60, 50 or 62 Ds. But the possible coalition of the Social Democrats and the Labour Party, because the Green Party and Fine Gael full coalition. But I was quite shocked by Fianna Fáil. Their support's going down, and they're told that would the coalition last with Michael Martin and Leo Varadkar, would Varadkar take over, or was he in some scandal that resigned?
Thanks, Kevin. I mean, I think that's very interesting set of points there, actually, in the sense that, clearly unionism is under the cosh in a lot of different directions. I think I don't think nationalists should be getting smug about that, because the last thing nationalism needs is a insecure unionism, because that is going to lead to very little political movement. The thing that Irish nationalism needs is a unionism that's confident, and you're much more likely to get a constructive engagement if that's the case. Now, back on your point about the DUP coming in second place, there's another example where the DUP have tied themselves to a political virility test that actually has got nothing to do with the union and very little to do with anything other than being top dog. And it works quite well electorally, because it can say, vote for the DUP or you get Sinn Féin as First Minister. And that has been quite an effective tactic for trying to get votes for the first preference votes for the DUP. It was offered by Sinn Féin the opportunity, as I recall, election or two ago, to sort of have a joint First Minister position, and it didn't want it because it wanted to play this card of stressing the importance of the DUP being First Minister, when actually it doesn't really matter in terms of the functioning of the institutions or the power of those institutions. But of course, it does matter internally within unionism for sort of bragging rights and so on. So again, this comes back to the point where the DUP has, I think, got to work out a strategy that gets it out, and unionism generally has got to work out a strategy that gets it to where it wants to be. People like Peter Robinson, I remember going to a talk by Peter Robinson years ago in Britain, actually, where he was talking about saying that, the DUP has, just needs to not give unionists a reason not to vote for it, because every election we're getting votes for the UUP. And the problem now is the DUP has given reasons not to vote for it, and unionists are taking those options. The problem with the TUV is it's very much identified with Jim Allister, and there will be a lot of unionists who wouldn't want to go near it. That being said, there's definitely a niche there. Jim Allister's certainly a very effective communicator politically, so he will certainly, I think, become more popular as an option. The question for me, though, I think there's a natural ceiling on Jim Allister's vote, on the TUV's vote. The issue for me is the UUP and whether it can make any inroads at all. And if it can't make any inroads, what's it for? And that's it. I'm sure UUP strategists are probably thinking that through now. But yeah, there's lots of interesting dynamics, and of course, Northern Ireland politics is fascinating, and that's why we're all doing this. So it's amazing.
All right, let's take one last question. I can see Kevin Mullen's hand. So Kevin, over to you.
Hi, thank you. I was just thinking a lot, just to broadly through this discussion, thinking about figures, political figures and political parties, and I was just wondering if we talk about these people in the centre, or the people that were winnable to, constitutional positions. Is there room for a position that we haven't really thought about yet, or people who are motivated less by the constitutional, or is there more of a community organising basis that could spring up over the next few years that gives us some other different perspective or way forward? Is there a kind of greater imagination out there that needs to come about to resolve issues for whatever time it can be?
Thanks, Kevin. Great question. There's certainly that constituency there. The Alliance Party might say that that's what they're for. This sort of much more cosmopolitan, party that can connect nationalists and unionists who can live underneath it. We've had other attempts to try and reframe party politics. You know, the Labour Party has sort of struggled in the past to get any traction. We had NI21 that sort of died at birth, it seemed, to have a sort of more liberal approach to unionism. So it's interesting that we definitely are having a cohort of people in the centre, younger, more liberal, more urban, probably less religious. They're definitely there, but we don't yet have the political vehicles that they would maybe adhere to. I suppose what I'm interested in more is the degree to which the political parties adjust to try and mop up those votes and try and move into that space. I'm sure they won't ignore that space. So I think you're more likely to get an attempt by the existing political parties to sort of love bomb that constituency or those constituencies. You've also got the Green Party in Northern Ireland. So, you know, we've no shortage of parties. But I think the interesting thing is that this is clearly a growing constituency. And I think that increasingly political parties are going to cotton on to the fact that it's a vital one for them to connect into. And it might result in the existing parties trying to, try to connect in with them rather than new political vehicles arriving.
Okay, Kevin, thank you very much for your question. So I'm sure we could, and indeed we will, continue to chew over these themes and issues over the next few months and indeed years. They're not going away anytime fast. It's been great to have the opportunity this afternoon with Feargal's presentation to review how we got here, where we are now, and where we may be going in the near future. Can I ask you all to thank Feargal for presenting to us this afternoon and to getting us to think coherently about these problems. So if you wouldn't mind just maybe unmuting yourselves, and we can give Feargal a round of applause in the traditional way.
Okay, thanks for all the questions, and thanks to you, Peter, as well.
Absolutely, no, great to have you, Feargal, and hopefully we'll have you in the flesh, so to speak, at the institute before too long. Once we all get jobbed and back to some degree of normality.
Yeah.
In the meantime, we're taking a break over the next 3 weeks with the Irish Studies Seminar. Our next seminar is on the 19th of April. We have Emily Pine from UCD, who will be speaking about the witness as commodity, the value of testimony in recent Irish culture. Emily's doing really interesting work on the relationship between memory and trauma, and drama in particular in contemporary Ireland. So please do join us. We'll be putting up an Eventbrite to register for that, and publicising it through our normal channels. I'll be on the 19th of April. Okay, so thank you all for coming and for participating. It's been a really great session. Thank you again to Feargal, and good afternoon.
Okay, bye.